Welcome to my boudoir, where I give fortunes of the future. Let's see what your future has in store. Oh, love is on its way. But hold, there is also heartbreak. A new path to be taken. Will you take the leap of faith? Better decide soon, because it is fast approaching. And if you are not careful, changes will be made. Now step into this world of magic, mayhem, and mystery as I show you how to become a mod witch like myself and review Grady Hendrix's Witchcraft for Wayward Girls. Come on in. Hey Ghoulies, welcome back to my YouTube channel where we dive into the world of horror books, makeup, and survival tips. We have a special treat for you today because we are going to be reviewing Grady Hendrix's latest novel, Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, all while doing a mod-inspired witch makeup look, kind of inspired by The Love Witch, which is a movie that you definitely need to check out if you love this book because it gives off similar vibes. All right, folks, so we're going to go ahead and dive in. But before we do so, please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and turn on notifications because you never want to miss any video that I put out if you are interested in everything paranormal, makeup, witchy, horror related. Go ahead and click it right now. You should do so right now. Come on, before you do it. Come on, before you proceed. All right. Let's go! Now we're going to get started with our first segment, which has to do with giving like a historical background to the book, kind of connections that I had with the book. So today we're going to be talking about famous women in history that have actually been accused of witchcraft and were actually murdered because of it. And all the makeup products that I'll be using, I'll try my best to say what they are, but if I don't, I'll definitely have a list in the video description of everything that I use. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and get started with my first base, which is from a priming spray from Trixie Cosmetix. So this is good to kind of prime your skin, get it nice and wet for everything. So the first person that I'm going to talk about is Hypatia. So Hypatia was a Greek philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer from Alexandria, Egypt. And she is best known for being kind of this philosophy teacher that a lot of people admired. And a lot of people were like, yeah, like I definitely enjoy being like her teacher or her student. That just squirted everywhere. Okay. And so, excuse me while I take off. It got into my nail. Okay. Anyways, so Hypatia, she was awesome. I was going to say a word, but then I probably would get flagged. She, like, so one of her students came on to her and was like, yo, I love you so much that, like, I want to be your boo thing. And she was like, all right, well, here's my rag with my menstrual cycle. And of course, the student was like repulsed by it. He was like, what the heck? And she was like, well, you know, you want to be with me, but, you know, are you ready for this part? And so she was known as a virgin as well. So she was, you know, never had a man, never, you know, did anything. Because she was just like so focused in her studies of astronomy and math and philosophy. And so she was like, nah, I ain't got time for men, which work, girl, work. And so she was actually respected for her wisdom, and she would actually be sought after for consultations on how to handle like politics And so she lived in the time when Rome actually had power over Egypt. So it's the Greco-Roman period. And she would give advice to the Roman prefect who was in charge. And, kind of say like, hey, like this is like what the people are saying. This is kind of like what we're experiencing and all of that good stuff. Now, of course, this is also at the time when Christianity is on the rise. And so, Jesus is doing his thing. He died. And so his followers are growing immensely. And so, of course, with this, her intellectualism and her, siding with the Roman prefect did not go well with leaders of the Christian church. And so she was actually murdered by a Christian mob. Very brutally, I might add. I'm not going to go into details onto how she was murdered, but she was really murdered. And so the reasons why they murdered her, are because apparently she was connected to Satanism, witchcraft, and she was using her magic charm to persuade the Roman prefect to rule in certain ways. And so people were like, oh, that's, we cannot have that in our, midst. And it's just like, every time a woman espouses any type of intellectualism, they've automatically been kind of deemed dangerous. So, of course, she gets murdered, but then she becomes a martyr, and then she is deemed a saint later on, a saint of philosophy and of all that different stuff. And so, of course, but not before she gets brutally murdered. And so that is Hypatia. So that's kind of like the first instance. The next person that I want to talk about is Joan of Arc, which many of you should be familiar with her. If you've taken any history class in school, you should be familiar with Joan of Arc. If you're not, I'm going to tell you all about her. So Joan of Arc was born in France, and she was kind of seen as, or she had stated that she had conversations with, or she was visited by, or the Archangel Michael. Sorry, I had a blip right there. And that she was getting visions from God to save France. And of course, during that time, it was the 100 Years' War between England and France, where France was trying to gain control of their territory and kind of kick England out and make sure that England was not going to take their land. And so she successfully, through divine intervention, as she stated, she was being sent by God to lead in the crusade to free the French. And she successfully did. She led in the battle of, I don't know if I know we call it Orleans, like New Orleans, but so there's an Orleans in France, which is why, we have New Orleans. And so, but I know in the movie, if you've ever watched Saint Joan, they call it Orleans. I don't know if that's how you actually pronounce it. So during the siege of Orleans, she leads the French into battle successfully, gets them to win, and then ultimately she places Charles on the throne of France, and he's like the king. And so, yeah, so she's like celebrated, and she like definitely went against like gender norms, and she wore men's armor, and she was like, nah, like, like she led an entire army to fight the English. But then afterwards, she was charged with heresy, and people thought that she was demonic for having heard these visions from God. And that, like, why would God go to a woman? And so the church condemned her, and they burned her at the stake. Yet again, when a woman shows power, they decide to silence her. So that is Joan of Arc's story. Of course, she was also deemed a saint later on in her time, and she was canonized and all that stuff when you become a saint, just like Hypatia. So the next part that we're going to talk about is, of course, the Salem witch trials. If you don't know what the Salem witch trials are, here we go. Here's your history lesson from a history teacher. So the Salem witch trials were here in the United States, and a lot of people were being accused of witchcraft. The very first one that was accused was Tituba, who was an enslaved woman, and she was accused of teaching the young girls the ways of witches and witchcraft and all that stuff. And, not with a lot of evidence, but because, Puritanism and all that stuff, people believed it, and people were like, witch! And it was just an all-out, kind of, every person for themselves kind of place. Because a lot of people were accusing their neighbors, they were accusing, people they didn't like, and it just kind of ended up being a lot of like, oh, I don't like you, I'm going to call you a witch in church, and people were like, yes, she's a witch, and, so literally, like, your friend could call you a witch, and then get other people to get behind them, and then call you a witch, and then the people would believe them. Which, is messed up because, it was not based off of evidence. It was not based off of any kind of facts or anything like that. It was strictly really just like, oh, I don't like you, so I'm going to call you a witch. Now, there are many theories to what actually happened during the Salem witch trials. A lot of people think that that the bread that they were eating had a hallucinogen because it was already kind of expired, and that the hallucinogen was causing people to see witches flying. Which, I mean, it's a plausible theory. I mean, if you were on any kind of hallucinogen and you were like, whoa, and of course, like, back then, they didn't know, right? Like, they wouldn't have known, like, yes, we know what a hallucinogen is. So they would have been like, bruh, this is wild. So that could be a thing, that can definitely be something. So, of course, that's one theory. Another theory is, of course, people were just wanting to get rid of their neighbors and gain land and all these things, because what they were seeing was that once people were hanged for being witches, then their neighbor would be like, oh, well, I'm going to claim their land because they're gone now. So, if you ever watch or read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, it kind of touches on that. So it's definitely like, it's sketchy. So the Salem witch trials, a lot of innocent women, and then Giles Corey was, like, I think one of the only men. I'm not sure if there were other men that were accused. But of course, if women were seen to be too intellectual to speak their mind, to be kind of like, you know, their own person. A lot of spinsters were also kind of deemed as witches because they were like, well, you know, why don't you have a husband? Why don't you have a man, or a boyfriend? Like, something's wrong with you if you don't desire to have a husband. And people were like, you know, I don't want a husband because I just don't want to. So a lot of them were deemed witches, and they were wrongfully accused and hanged. No witches were ever burned here in the United States. Understand that. That is a crucial difference between the Salem witch trials and the witch trials of Europe. So that is definitely something that is different. So just the biggest theme with this book and kind of with witches overall and like the concept of witchcraft is that oftentimes women who have shown any form of intellectualism are always deemed as witches, and it is kind of a way for the patriarchy to oppress women and to silence women, is to tell them that they're witches and to create witch hunts and to silence them by accusing them of being witches and then murdering them. And so we've seen it throughout history. We've seen it in recent years. And this book, it comes at a very pivotal time in this country, and I feel that a lot of the themes connect to what still goes on today. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next segment. So I will see you in a minute. All right, so next up, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into going into the themes of the book and reviewing it, and just overall talking about different things that I liked about the book, different things that I enjoyed. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Most Concealer from KimChi in Golden Sand, and I'm just going to kind of cut the lower brow. And as I discuss this, I'm going to just talk about the book real quick and just talk about the things that I liked about it. So first off, what I enjoyed is, if you read the audiobook, you won't get this, but if you actually read through the book and read through the introduction and the prologue, you actually get a lot of information from the author himself about how he came about doing this book and how he, understands that he is a straight cisgender male writing about women and their experiences. And I appreciated that because, not a lot of authors will say like, hey, like, I understand like my positionality as a white straight male in a patriarchal society who, benefits from being a male. And, I'm obviously talking about, women's issues, but I think it's important that, he talks about these and uses his platform to be able to discuss these issues, and kind of give it to us in a way that we already kind of know in terms of like, witchcraft, and kind of connecting it that way, which I appreciated. And I appreciate that he actually wrote that introduction, because then he also talks about how he had family members who went to wayward houses and that he would have never known if they had never told him, and how this is just like a crucial thing that needs to be discussed in just everyday, the story that needs to be brought to light, which I appreciate. And so there's that. That's what I appreciated a lot about the author and him bringing these points to light. So the book is set in 1970. That's where it starts off. And it follows this girl, 15 years old, who is taken to a wayward house, which, if you don't know what a wayward house is, sorry, I should have defined that in the first place. A wayward house, or wayward houses, were places where girls would be sent if they were pregnant teenage mothers, and they would go there to wait out their pregnancy because, again, back in those times from the 1950s, I don't quite know from when to when wayward houses were a thing, but for sure in like the 50s and for sure in the 70s, they were a huge thing within the United States. And these young girls would be sent there because their families did not want them to, or want anyone to know that they were pregnant. So they would go there, spend the 9 months or however many months they were there until they gave birth, and then they would give up their baby for adoption, and then they would come back and live their life as if nothing happened. And there's a sort of trauma to that, right? Because you go to a wayward house as a young teenage girl, not really knowing if you're going to see your parents again, but there's the promise, that like, yeah, your parents will pick you up. It's like, do you really know if your parents are going to pick you up after the 9 months after the baby's born? And you feel ashamed because you've brought shame to your family and all this other stuff. And and then so in the book, it starts off with Fern being dropped off at this wayward house, and she kind of gives the backstory as to how she got pregnant and how her dad won't look at her anymore the same, and like doesn't talk to her. And the whole ride that they're going to the wayward house, like, he's just kind of quiet, he doesn't say anything. He gives her his wedding ring so that way she seems like that she's married, even though she's a 15-year-old girl. And then they get to the wayward house. She checks in, and her dad leaves, like, straight up leaves her, like, without saying goodbye. And so that part in itself traumatizes Fern, which Fern isn't actually her real name. It is a name given to her at the house by the matron who runs it, Miss Wellwood. Which in a way is so dehumanizing, right? Because you go there and all of a sudden you're given a name. She's given a different place of birth or where she's from. And all the girls in the house, they're given plant names or flower names. Like, there's a girl named Rose, there's a girl named Holly, there's a girl named Zinnia. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Not too sure. And so she's Fern. And it's like from a Rolodex of like cards and stuff like that. And so a lot of the times these names get recycled. And they explain that the naming is so that way the girls never know who they truly are, so they hide their true identities, which in a way I understand, right? Because like that's the whole point, is like your anonymity, because then you go back into the real world and you you go on with life as if nothing happened. But there's a sort of sadness to that. There's, at least when I was reading it, it's like like I think about the Crucible, where the guy, they want him to confess to being a witch, and then they're like, oh yeah, we'll sign your name to say that you're a witch. And he's like, no, because that is my name, I only have one. And it's true, like, we only have one name in this life, and like, for someone to take that away from you, I don't know, I found that dehumanizing in a way, to just kind of give you a plant name. But then again, it's like, that protection, and it's like, so that's the big thing with this book, is there is this fine line where you go back and forth of like, okay, well, who's in the right, who's in the wrong? Like, this is messed up, but like, it sucks because, and then at the end, in the epilogue or the afterword, the author does say like, hey, like for some women, this was like a good thing. Like a lot of them appreciated that they were able to hide away for a few months and and have the baby and start anew. But for others, it was terrible, right? So it really depended on your situation. Um, but overall, it's just very, I don't know. It just gave me a lot of vibes, and that's what I also appreciate about the book is that it makes you question, like, damn, like who really like is in the right, who's in the wrong, because then you get introduced to the witches, which we'll talk about in a moment, and you're just like, damn. So one of the first themes that we encounter, or that not one of the first that we encounter, but one of the overall themes is this theme of empowerment and rebellion. And so, you know, like I said, when they're in Wellwood House, the girls are under strict supervision and they're under a lot of, strict rules and regulations, and they can do this, but they can't do that. And there's like a doctor that tells them, like, oh, you can't have salt and you can't have, this, and you can only be drinking this and not that. And so a lot of the girls are like, what the heck? Like, this is terrible. And that, like, they have to be in bed by a certain time, and their autonomy is severely limited. And what's interesting is in the book, the girls, so the main group of girls are Holly, Fern, Rose, and Zinnia. Zinnia is also the only black girl in the house, so that also adds a certain level of like complexity between the relationships, because again, she is the only black girl in the house, and so it's kind of like, huh. So there's a very different dynamic when it comes to how she acts and how she is, um, moving along in the world. And so the four of them, they come across this book that is given to them by a librarian, and it's mostly given to Fern. And, the librarian is like seen as this like really nice older lady, and she's like, kind of like when you think of like librarian, like when you picture a librarian, this is what this librarian is described as. And so she gives them this book called How to Be a Groovy Witch, which kind of inspired the mod makeup look for today. And so then this book, she tells them, like, yeah, this book is going to be like your way of being able to rise in a sense, right? Like you'll be able to do things that you have never thought you could have done. And it's very interesting. It's really, really interesting, because then they're like, ooh, what if we can, like take matters into our own hands? And so it's, again, this idea of reclaiming that autonomy that is so enticing to the girls. And of course, they do a spell first. And so they start to see, like, oh, like this is like for real, for real. So then they start to get into this idea of empowerment and rebellion and wanting to. And then Rose is this like really like stick it to the man type of personality, and a lot of it stems from her, right? A lot of the resistance comes from her, because she's like, screw this, screw that. And she kind of goes around and kind of inspires the other girls to kind of be like that. But then the other girls are also very hesitant because they don't want to like rock the boat. But not Holly, Rose is there to kind of be like, nah, like we gotta gotta nip this in the bud. And so that kind of encompasses the whole idea of this notion of empowerment and wanting to rebel against societal restrictions and what they deem, what society deems inappropriate for a girl their age to act like. Because when they're in the house, they're like, oh yeah, well, you have to act like this. And they get like lessons about, religion and all this other stuff and how a woman should act and how they should be after. And a lot of the people are telling them what they have to do and what they cannot do afterwards. And they're constantly starting to go against that. So that's an interesting part from the book that I really, really enjoyed this idea, especially reading it during Women's History Month. Another theme for this book is sisterhood and shared trauma. And a lot of that has to do with kind of like the relationships that the girls build with each other, especially Holly, Rose, Zinnia, and Fern. A lot of them are, it's this idea that a lot of them go through the similar hardships and they're kind of like going through the same thing. So they're kind of like, and so it's definitely the complex bonds that they form because, a lot of them, like Rose is very much like, we need to stick it to the man. And then Zinnia's like, no, we have to kind of wait things out. We need to make sure that like, Zinnia is more of like the law-abiding one, right? Which, is complex because she is Black, so she understands how the world works for her, right? Because she's like, hey, like, you white people, y'all can say whatever you want to say, like, y'all are not going to get in trouble. But if I say something, like, that's a whole different story. So I understand why in the book she is a little bit more of the reserved one. And it's like, in terms of like going full force into things, which adds a lot of the complexities of the book in terms of their relationship, because they kind of, Fern is kind of in the middle and she's like, ooh, like, I know, like, Rose, I know what you're talking about, girl. But then she also like looks at Zinnia and it's like, I get your side too. So before I go further into this, I just want to say that I'm using this palette from Widow Witch Cosmetics. This is the Love Widow Witch palette, inspired by the film. And I'm going to go in to my crease to kind of just create like a dark kind of crease to go around the blue that I'm going to be putting in afterwards. So yeah, let's go into it. So, of course, they have a lot of shared trauma, these girls, that they just go through. And a lot of them, and I think that that's what builds their bond a lot. And I appreciate the complexities of that bond because they're, they go through a lot within the book. They go through a lot and they go through a lot of hardships that, in order for them to kind of survive, they kind of have to rely on each other. And both, to survive the home, but to also survive the witches, because then at some point they make the witches mad. I was going to say another thing, but again, I don't want to be canceled on YouTube. And so all they really have is each other. And so they want to make sure that they go through it together. And it really is a really strong, empowering bond that they all have with each other. And the ending of the book really shows that. I'm not going to say what happens at the end because I want you, if you haven't read it, I want you to be able to read it and kind of experience it on your own. But I just want to say that sisterhood, that bond is really important. And that like it was crucial for their survival in the Wellwood house. Now, no one dies, unfortunately, not to say unfortunately, but no one dies in the book, but, well, did one die? Not really, no. But, there is a lot of pain. Another theme, kind of moving on, kind of similar, is societal oppression and control. Now that is mostly like the center of the book, and what the book is really all about is like this societal oppression, right? And putting women through this pain um of having to go to a house, having to be away from their family because of societal thoughts on how women should be, and that like it would bring shame to the family if the daughter was seen as pregnant, and then like so there's that idea that like Fern has to leave, that they all have to leave their families to be able to live out their pregnancy in a different place alone, which again is why that sisterhood is so important, because they don't have their families, so they kind of have to create their own chosen families, which is so crucial in the end, and I appreciate that so much. Like it almost made me to the points where it almost made me cry. But a lot of the depiction of Wellwood House is based off of historical accounts of what these wayward houses were like. And it's just also like the idea that that society just treats women like crap. I'm sorry, I had to say it like that. I had to. Because and it's very true, because when one of the girls goes into giving birth to her child, the way that they describe the situation is very cold. Like when she goes into the hospital, they call her by Fern or Jane Doe. They kind of look at her in disgust because they know that she is a teenage mother and that she doesn't have a husband, and so they kind of treat her as such. And so like there's just it's a very different feeling that you get when you see how she's treated versus how, like, when another girl gives birth through midwives, how that there's a difference in how they're treated. In the hospital, it's just very like, let's get this done. Let's just get the baby out, and then, screw whatever, they and then the way that they describe how they have to like make certain incisions is just it's very like barbaric, the way that childbirth is dealt with in hospitals. And it's just kind of a reflection of how things are today, because so many people complain, or a lot of people still die by childbirth, because still it's very like there's just a lot of practices that shouldn't be happening. And a lot of people do actually say that the way that we give childbirth, or the way that women give childbirth today, is actually not how it's supposed to be done. So like women shouldn't be on their backs, but they should be like in a crouched position. But I don't know. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm just an educational doctor. So I don't know too much about that. But, it is sad to go through that and then just feel like so angry because of how she's being treated in the hospital. And just how they're treated in general, like the women, and just how like there's a lot of things going on in the house that you're just like, oh, that you're angry about because you're like, I want to like reach into the book and just like slap all these people. But you can't. And then, still to this day, that I feel like there's still so many like judgments on women who get pregnant, and it's just like it connects so well to today. Because I feel like women today are still very much like demonized for their bodies or wanting to have autonomy of their bodies. And I feel like this book came out at such a crucial time in our nation's history because we have an administration that wants to control the bodies of women, very much so. And so it's very much like that idea of wanting to control women and wanting to control their bodies. So I feel like this book, if you're really wanting to have a book kind of connect to what you're feeling right now, this is the book for you. And I think that everyone should read this book for sure. Like, I think that it's has such a powerful message of sisterhood and of just like the oppression that women have to endure as women just by being born women. It's sucky. It sucks. So yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish doing the whites of my eyes, and I'll come back with the last theme. All right, the last thing that we're going to talk about is the allure and cost of power. So, like I said before, the girls are given a spell book called How to Be a Groovy Witch. And at first, they kind of don't really know how to read it, but Fern knows how to read it, and then like the book kind of transforms for them. It kind of changes, and it gives them what they need, and they start to do spells. And so one of the very first spells that they do is they hex the doctor because Zinnia has a lot of morning sickness. And they're kind of annoyed with the doctor on telling Zinnia like how to control her morning sickness and telling her that her problems are non-existent. And so they're like, bro, that is a bunch of BS. And so they do a spell to transfer Zinnia's morning sickness to the doctor, and it works. And they're like, whoa, like this is so cool. And they're like, wow, like we actually have magical powers and we can actually like do this. Like that's like really cool. And so, of course, they start to want to do other things, and they start to want to, handle, other people. And so they meet with the librarian again. And when because they get visited by a dog, the dog leads them to the librarian, who turns out, of course, she's a witch. And so Zinnia at first is like, yo, like, I don't know about this. Like, y'all, I don't think I can get behind this. And the other girls are like, we have to. And then, like, so, and then, the witch is like, well, if you want to learn more from the book, if you want to get more from the book, you're going to have to, sign your name in my book and, kind of do my bidding, essentially. Like, whatever I ask you to do, like, you're going to have to do. And so they're kind of like, ooh, I don't know. And it isn't until Holly speaks, which at the beginning, Holly doesn't really speak in the book. She doesn't say anything. And she comes at them with like, "I'm having God's baby," and you're like, "What?" Um, and then you find out later, which ties into like societal oppression, is that her preacher SA'd her, um, and that is whose baby she's having. Um, and so of course, like when the girls find this out, they're like, okay, well, we have to figure out how to help Holly, get away from the preacher or the pastor, whatever he's called. Because, he's not a good person, and we need to save Holly from this fate. Um, and so they sign their name in the book, and then they're trying to, do these like spells to do this other stuff, and then they get caught by the cook, who is a black woman, and she also is a midwife, and so she knows like the dark side of witchcraft, and she's like, nah, like y'all are messing too much with this stuff. And you know and then so it comes at a price, right? All magic comes at a price, no matter who you are, no matter what you do, it comes at a price. And the girls don't really believe that until afterwards. When the witch is trying to transfer herself into Fern, because she's dying and she wants her line to be passed down. And so Fern's like, well, I mean, I guess. And they're like, I don't know. I don't know about giving away my life, like, to some random lady that I just met. And so there's that concept of like giving up, something in return for power. And so they're like, I don't know. And then, Rose does another spell, and there's just a lot of things that happen, and this is kind of like where the complex relationship between Fern and Zinnia come into play, because Zinnia's like, no, like we can't like let this lady win. Like, I know we need to help our friend, but like we need to make sure that we're good. And we can't just give away our autonomy to this woman. And Fern is battling this, and so ultimately Fern is like, yeah, no, I don't want to do that. But of course this comes at a price, because the witch is like, well, like, you have my book, and then you use spells, so this is the price. You have to do this. And they're like, nah. And so they're trying to hide from the witch for a good part of the book. And then the witch threatens them too with like, well, if you don't do it, then then I'm gonna force you to, and then you're gonna be forced to be this like, there's like another, in the witch's like coven, there's a witch who's kind of not in the right mind, but because she was forced into being or having to take up the knowledge, and so that's why she's not all there. And so the whole time Fern is afraid of doing that. And then the whole plot is them just wanting to make sure that Holly is safe, but ultimately not being able to find a way to save her. Well, I mean, they find a way, but ultimately it's it's not everything is what it seems. So that's why a lot of the times, like throughout the book, you're reading it and you're like, okay, well, are the witches right? are the people at the house right? Like, who is right in this situation? But then that's the dilemma that you have, right? That like you're spending this time trying to figure out like, okay, who is in the right? And then, you're just kind of like, well, like, kind of have to figure that out for yourself. And you kind of have to be like, like at the end of it all, you have to be the one to decide for yourself, which is, a lot of what goes into the book. And I think that is the biggest message, is that like at the end of the day, you have free will to do what you need to do, and that is how you have to go about things. Because if you don't, then that's not going to help you in any way, shape, or form. Because then you're going to be listening to one side, not the other. So ultimately, you have to kind of guide yourself and how you go about doing a lot of the things. So, I've already done the eyes. I've already done, well, the next part is to kind of create the crease. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Alright, so now that I've finished my eyes, we're going to go ahead and start off with talking about how then do you survive this book? How do you go about, if you were a character in this book, how would you survive? How would you go through it? And ultimately, how do you survive? Because that's how we do. We're the final queer, we're the final people. We always survive in the end. And so the very first part in surviving this book is to stay off the matron's radar. So essentially to kind of be on the down low. Like, yes, you are wanting to, rebel and do so and kind of go against the restrictions, but you want to do so not, you don't want to be like Rose, right? Because Rose is very like, yeah, like stick it to the man, like I'm gonna be forthright on this. Whereas Fern is very smart with how she goes about, um, figuring out how to bypass a lot of the restrictions, and she kind of plays the game, right? She goes about it and she is able to then, trick and maneuver her way through the house, by keeping her head down and by, you know, creating allyships and doing all the things. I mean, which is why she's able to, at one point, poison one of the people in the house, because she kind of plays yeah, I'm the good girl. I'm gonna play by the rules, and I'm going to make sure that everything is done well and that everything is clean and precise. Um, so that's one way that you can kind of make sure that you are kind of just staying low and you're not causing too much trouble, but you're also not, like Rose, right? Where Rose is like for sure causing all this trouble. And I'm using KimChi's Thailor contour in the shade Mocha, which if you need contour, this has always been my go-to contour. I love it so much. And so the next part is choose your friends wisely, because you want to make sure that you have friends that are going to be your ride or dies. And so that's kind of what Fern does, is she chooses her friends who are going to follow her, right, and be there for her. And of course, go through her and understand what she's going through. Now, there are parts where I'm not saying that she doesn't have her fights with her friends, but ultimately, you also need your friends that are going to kind of bring you down to earth and kind of tell you like, yo, this is not working out. Like, we need to figure out something else, because you need those friends that are going to tell you what you need to hear. Because a lot of the times, we have friends that will just tell you like, yeah, like this is how you go about it. This is how you should go about it. And they're kind of yes people, and you don't need a lot of yes people in your life. You need people that are going to tell you the truth straight out. Because other than that, why else are you going to need that kind of person in your life? Because then that doesn't work out either. And then, yeah. And so a lot of the times when they're in Wellwood House, they have to rely on each other a lot. And when you have that bond and that friendship that they create, that's when you know, like, okay, for sure, these are my people. This is how I'm going to survive. And you need that, especially in this situation when you're in this book. For the next part, for my bronzer, I'm going to use Fenty Caramel Cutie. It's a Stalk'r. Listen to that. I love, that's why I love nails. The next way to survive this, I can't open this. Okay, there we go. The next step in surviving this book is respecting the magic. Now, again, all magic comes at a price. And the magic in this book definitely comes with the price. And the author in the introduction was very forthcoming in explaining like, hey, like, I'm not the end all be all in terms of what is magic and all that stuff, which I appreciate, because he was like, hey, like, all magic is different. It's not all the same. He explained how he pulled from different practices of magic, which, yes, it definitely helps to understand, because, yeah, not all magic is the same. And there's definitely different variances of magic. And so I appreciate that he talks about it. But in the end, of course, you want to be careful with the magic that you choose to play with, and respecting how powerful it can be, whether it's, doing a hex or doing a simple manifestation spell or a money spell, and people will tell you, it's a craft. You have to know and understand how to work it and how to use it, and there may be some unexpected consequences that stem from using that magic. So just being aware of what you're doing and how that may either come back to bite you in the end or how that will, play out later on. But just be respectful of magic, be respectful of people who use magic. Yeah, I mean, just have a game plan. The next step in being able to survive this is have an escape plan. If things go south, what are you going to do to prevent certain things from happening? If the staff at Wellwood House is cracking down on you, or if there are supernatural forces turning against you, what is your way out? You want to make sure, and then they had the whole plan to help save Holly. Like, so what is the plan? And you need to really think everything through and think about how then do you escape when all odds are against you, essentially. So what is that? What is your plan? And really think everything through, because there's a part where they have a plan to escape, but then they don't think everything through, and they're kind of just like, ugh. And so, there's that part. So really, you have to really think about how you're going to escape. How are you going to survive? How are you going to, move from place to place if you don't have money? How are you going to get money? And all that stuff. Because, again, their plan in the book definitely required them to have money, which they didn't at the time. And so, there lies the rub, the issue of how then are they going to get through it all. Another thing is to not let the guilt consume you. So throughout the book, a lot of the girls have to make these really tough choices. And you have to learn from your mistakes and just make sure to move forward. And figure out how to eventually go back to those things later on, right? Like, for example, like, it's a sucky feeling, but one of the girls has to give up her baby. Well, I mean, all of them have to give up their child, right? And they obviously go through that pain of having to go through that, but then it's like, okay, how do you move forward from that when you make that decision? Because a lot of them, they get told like, oh, well, if you don't, if you choose not to give up your baby for adoption, then you're going to have to repay a lot of what you've kind of taken from the house. And it's a bunch of BS, honestly. It's a bunch of BS, because they tell them like, oh yeah, well, you stayed at this house for free, but because, if you're not going to, if you're going to keep the baby, then that means you're going to have to give back what you owe. And do you have that money? And so they kind of guilt trip them into giving up the baby, which is hard for some people because, again, like, you spend all this time creating this being inside of you, and then you have to give it up. Like, it's just sad. So I'm going in with the Summer of Love blush palette from Trixie Cosmetix, just because to go on theme, and I feel like the pink goes with the blue. I apologize if my audio changed, because halfway through I realized my mic was not on. So I apologize, y'all. I apologize. It happens. I'm learning through these experiences. And so, but you can't let the guilt completely take you over, but it sucks. The things that they had to go through, the decisions they have to make, because again, they kind of make the choice of like, well, if I can't, provide for my child, then I have to try and give my child a better life, even if that means giving them up. But in the book, we find out later that they end up finding them again. They end up finding their children again, and it's so beautiful. And it just goes to show that, like, goes back to the theme of the trauma and all the things that they had to go through to make sure that their child had a better life. But then obviously, like, that guilt that they hold on to of like of, you know, giving up their child. It's a lot. Another way to survive this book is to watch out for the real threat. And this is where you have to trust your instinct. Is it, because a lot of the times, like I said, this book makes you kind of go back and forth, like, okay, who's really the enemy here? Is it the witches? Is it the Wellwood staff? Who really is the enemy? And I mean, kind of the answer is like everyone. And then you're just kind of like, damn, these girls like can't catch a break from anything. And you're just like, bruh. And you're just kind of sticking in the middle, but being able to understand where the true evil lies, that's when you're able to make your decisions, and have autonomy over yourself, because again, that's how you're going to be able to really kind of do things for you and figure out how you're going to proceed, because again, it all depends on your intuition, on your feeling of people. Because again, Fern kind of makes the decision of like, well, you know, the witches, like, they're not too bad. But then also like, I don't want to give up my autonomy to the witches or to the main witch, right? Because both are asking to give up her autonomy, both sides. So she's like, well, I mean, both sides suck. And ultimately she's like, you know what? At the end, I choose me. I choose me. I choose to be my own person. And I think that that's also another beautiful thing. That's like, you know, on both sides, both, you know, they offer great things for the girls, like the Wellwood girls. The staff offer them like protection from society and their judgment, but then also like, you know, they have to, you know, live in these very strict controlled conditions. And then the witches offer freedom and stuff, but then you have to like be, you know, at the bidding of the matron of the coven. So is it really freedom? Is it really, or both sides either have autonomy? Not really. So you kind of have to discern for yourself, like, okay, who really am I going to go with? And at the end, choose yourself. Choose yourself. And again, controlling your narrative. That's another way that you are going to be able to get through a lot of this is, again, controlling how people see you, how people perceive you, and being able to control your own path. And I think that at the heart of this is one of the bigger reasons why I enjoyed the book, because it's like, yeah, no, there's not a clear path. And ultimately, she chooses herself and kind of chooses her sisterhood and all that stuff. And yeah, so I am going to come back fully done with my makeup look. I'll see you then. And this is the finished look. And so thank you so much for everyone coming on this journey with me. Thank you for reading the books. If you read the books, if you don't, you definitely should. This is my little evening wear from Western Evil, so I hope it gives you some love witch vibes. So thank you all so much for going on this journey with me. If you are an enthusiast of makeup, or if you love horror books, or if you just want to learn how to survive a horror book or horror movie, go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel down below. Turn on notifications so you can see all the videos that I post up. And until then, stay spooky and blessed be.